Got it. Um, from a couple that have their cameras on, can I get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Okay, perfect, perfect. So, as was said, so I'm Dr. Kristy Brugar. I am a faculty member here at the University of Oklahoma, where I teach undergraduate and students in methods of social studies education and also work with our graduate students. And over the years have been truly, truly privileged to be able to work with the charge group and I think the heart group at a certain point. But it's just, it feels so good to be back in company with everyone in different ways. So I know from the introduction here that we've got probably some people that'll be watching weather and seeing if there'll be alerts and different things. So hopefully everything will go well and people will be safely in places they need to be both this evening and then into tomorrow. So when I chatted with Wendy about some of the sessions that I'm going to be working with you all around, she really encouraged me to think about the ways in which centering critical thinking and inquiry is sort of a direction that you're moving to as part of your grant and the work that you're doing with students. And so I'm going to spend today really helping us think about taking the instruction that we're doing and shifting it and centering critical thinking and inquiry in particular. And with that being said, again, I know we've got some folks that are in the car and in different places. So to the best of your ability, I'd like you to in the chat, simply identify 3 events in US history. They don't have to be things that you're teaching about right now, but just 3 events that come to mind. Hey, Kelly, thanks for getting us started with the Revolutionary War, 9/11. I thought this image might inspire that. Helena, thanks for adding that. Civil War, Boston Tea Party. Okay, I'm getting a sense as to where maybe like our 5th grade teachers are around the American Revolution or events leading in. It's always with that. Oh, Brandy, I like that you pull in Jesse Owens at the Olympics. Phenomenal. Good. Number of World War II. Desert Storm. Fantastic. Nice. And I'm not going to stop people from continuing to add because I'd like us to use these. And if you haven't had an opportunity or if you're driving and are beholden to the audio here, we've got examples of the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Civil War, Ellis Island. Just thinking about that and immigration. Marilyn, thank you for adding that. Yorktown, Desert Storm was mentioned, the Salem witch trials. Really nice diversity here. So as we look at these events that you shared, others shared in the chat, which would you say are the most significant? And you can use the list that's here, or if you were still in the thinking stage, I want you to identify again in the chat, if you don't mind, what do you see as the 3 most significant events in US history? 3 most significant events. Brandy, I appreciate that. It is tough. And then a different Brandy mentions the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and 9/11. Oh, nice. These are fantastic. And again, if you are able to, I'd like you to scroll through and see what some of the things that your colleagues are writing. Again, those of you that are beholden a little more to the audio. Leah, fantastic. And Leah, I might ask you to pop your microphone on and talk a little bit about, for just a moment, about how you discerned between, you've got in my lifetime 9/11. And so there's just that one. And then others, the Kennedy assassination and Pearl Harbor. Leah, can I put you on the spot to jump on with your microphone and talk a little bit about that?
I don't care one bit.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, there was no catastrophic anything. I grew up in the time where the Vietnam War was on the television every night. In my earliest exposure to news and or historical things. But 9/11 was the most catastrophic thing that happened in my lifetime, where I felt like we were under attack. Now, I sat many afternoons with my grandmother, who loved to talk about the past, and she talked about the feeling of what it felt like to be an American when Pearl Harbor was attacked. She was a young mother. She had, at that time, I think only 2 children, in the uncertainty of the time. And then she also talked, I mean, not every day was a history day with my grandmother, but she also talked about the pure fear, and the uncertainty again with the Kennedy assassination, even though that was not related to war. So that's why those three.
Fantastic. And I thank you for, again, coming on for the whole group and sharing and unpacking that it's not just, those aren't just an academic choices, but they're really part of your lived experience with your grandmother, as well as the lived experience of being an adult person during 9/11. So that's fantastic. Bobby, can I ask you to say a couple of words about the three choices that you identified here, as being most significant: the Revolutionary War, 9/11, and the Civil Rights Movement? Because again, I'm seeing a nice variety of things.
I think they were just major turning points for us. Revolutionary War, we're getting our freedom, we're becoming a new country. We're working things out, and it's all on our shoulders at that point. And then with the Civil War, we're having those growing pains. We've gotten our freedom, but not everybody has freedom. And so our country's going through a lot of growing pains, and just having to deal with that. And I know, being from the area I'm from, there's in Pulaski County and Nancy particular, there's a lot of sites, Civil War battle sites and things. So I kind of grew up around those, and so it was always a close place to my heart, being from that area. And then the Civil Rights Movement, once again, growing pains. And to me, it's all about growing pains, and it's how we keep pushing ourselves to be better and to be a better country and to do better.
Again, thanks so much, and I really appreciate the beach scene behind you. It's a nice tranquility here on a Monday afternoon. But key things that I heard you talk about, and there might be your colleagues who are thinking about different events, but with similar rationale. This idea that they're turning points, that they're evidence of growing pain, as the United States and U.S. history is sort of a growing living experience. And as you've talked about through programming, like, right, it's an experiment in some ways. And then I really appreciated that notion of connection to personal experience, that I think again linked really nicely to the ways in which Leah had just been talking about that. I'm going to call on one more person, if that's okay. So Elizabeth Jones, I like that because these are similar to what we just heard Bobby talk about, this Revolutionary War, but you've added government and then civil rights. And so I'm wondering if you could talk particularly about that idea of the significance in US history to the notion of government.
Well, it kind of ties into what Bobby said. Like, it's all on our shoulders now. We have this new nation. We have to figure out how to set it up. And I think it's just unbelievable that they had the foresight to set up some of the same important ideals that we go by today, that many years in the past. So I think government, just the whole foundational part of government, is a big part of our nation.
wonderful. And so that idea of what is nation and then our national history become somewhat synonymous here. So let's pivot back to the prompts that I had given you. These are all fantastic examples. Are these two prompts the same? And if so, then why would I ask two? And if they're different, what makes them different? And you can either turn on your microphone, or if you want to pop something into the chat, whichever works. Are these the two questions the same? Okay, if you can, would you give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down? Are they the same? Yes. Are they different? Thumbs down. Okay, I'm getting some thumbs down. I like Bobby's taking another, there's the third option of they're connected. So Bobby, how are they connected?
Well, they are very similar because, you asked for 3 events, but then we had to think, and through our connections, through our personal feelings, whatever, we had to prioritize those. And so, we had to take it a step further.
Oh, I like that. We had to take it a step further. So so I'm going to take us back to teacher preparation, but also a way of kind of pivoting our thinking. So these questions, I think absolutely they're related, but I was asking of you, and in turn, you might be asking of your own students, a couple of different things. That idea of identify 3 items is a basic recall of facts, right? Here are three things that I can identify. I can tell you in a list what they are. But then when I ask you to identify the 3 most significant, I'm drawing on some higher order thinking skills. I'm asking you to make connections, to evaluate, and create, in essence, your own list of things that are unique to the way you understand, the way you prioritize, and the way that you kind of situate US history. And so that was really nice to hear those rationales or different examples. And so I want to take just a couple of minutes and again, kind of lean back onto Bloom's taxonomy and thinking about how this and really a reorienting of this helps us think about critical thinking in our own classroom. Because I would make the argument that the first question I asked you to do was not a critical thinking experience. But in fact, the second question, that idea of prioritizing and thinking about notions of significance, was absolutely a critical thinking and higher order thinking skills. And so if you remember back, Bloom's taxonomy was developed in the middle of the 20th century. This idea of helping us think about and understand the ways in which we might identify content, skills, and experiences for students in our own lesson planning. And it follows a progression. And if we start at the bottom, because that tends to be what happens, there's this remember phase, which is a recall of basic information. You can see in this nice graphic from Vanderbilt University Center of Learning, gives you some really good verbs to describe. And I think those verbs are excellent prompts for thinking about the prompts we might provide to our students to promote these ways of thinking and responding. From remembering, we move into notions of understanding. So it's not just that identification, but how might we describe? And that describe, again, is sort of a one-to-one correlation. So when we talk about or identify the American Revolution as an event in US history, we might describe it as the war in which the independence of the United States was established. So there's not a deep dive into, but it's basically that definition that allows us to further understand that identified fact. Then we want to take the information that we have, that we've remembered, and that we're able to explain or that we understand and apply it to new contexts. And so that's what we heard a little bit in some of these explanations. It was thinking about how we are able to demonstrate a knowledge, to use information, to interpret significance, in this case, that concept of significance, in ways that are unique to each of us, but using a common context of US history events. From there, we think about analysis and how do we make connections between ideas? And that was what was really wonderful about a couple of the explanations. Thinking about this idea of the events I selected were turning points in US history, as I understand it, is a wonderful point of analysis. It's making these comparative relationships and being able to organize them in one way, shape, or form. From there, thinking about notions of evaluation and why I've chosen this. This is why these are my top 3. This is why I've agreed or disagreed with a bigger idea. And then finally, how might we create? And particularly as we think about inquiry, this notion of creating becomes very powerful. It's that not just the creation of a poster board or a website, but it's a new way of thinking. It's creating new knowledge, which is really powerful for our students to think about. We know from research that unfortunately, the majority of time in classrooms is spent in this remembering and understanding stage. And so those are often referred to as lower order thinking skills or lots. Some of these phrases, you might be like, of course, it's all coming back. But these lower order thinking skills, they're very much sort of a cause and effect for students to be presenting. What we want to work towards with our students is towards this idea of higher order thinking skills, where they're taking information from the remember and the understand, but really exercising application, analysis, and evaluation to demonstrate what they know and understand. And so it really centers the student and student learning very differently. And that helps us think about, because higher order thinking skills lead to or help us consider critical thinking. So again, I'd like you to take a moment and just jump back into the chat if you would. And I'd like you to in a phrase or a couple of words, what is critical thinking? I feel like critical thinking is one of those things we say a lot. Oh, we want to be critical thinkers, everybody, as we're thinking about our classrooms, or this is a critical thinking opportunity. But what does that really mean? So if that 6th grader came up to you and said, you know what, you use critical thinking a lot. What do you mean? Because I don't think I know. What's a word or a phrase that you might use to describe that for the students in your class? Oh, Kelly, I love this. Informative, thoughtful action. That's said with authority, like you have had to say that recently in your own classroom. I love it. Analyzing, thinking deeply about a topic. Lots of connections to analysis or analyzing. Nice connection to application of prior knowledge. Great. So it's getting us thinking about and I'm going to use, creativity. Joy, thank you for jumping in with that idea of creativity here. So I'm going with a research definition, but I think there are some key things that both are exemplified in your responses, but also I think are things that we need to be cognizant of. So we think about, so Scribner and Paul talk about or defined critical thinking as intellectually disciplined process. So we don't just kind of by happenstance critically think, but we really think about this as a process to skillfully conceptualize, apply, which we see in your responses, unsurprisingly, as well as analyzing and synthesizing and or evaluating information. One thing that we didn't see, let me finish the definition, then I want to go back here to conceptualize a little bit. Gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication. all of those were demonstrated as people responded verbally to that previous question, right? This idea of what are those significant events? There were things that you observed, you experienced with others, you reflected on what you know, what you knew, or the communities in which you lived to make a reasoned decision and then communicate that beyond either the chat or your head. And in this case, it's because I called on you and asked for your grace in order to respond. One thing that we didn't notice as much, so again, not surprising, smart group who's been working around these ideas for a while. We've got application, we see analysis, there are notions of synthesis, but not so much this idea of conceptualizing. What does it mean to conceptualize? Again, head to the chat and go, and if you don't mind, give me a synonym for conceptualizing. Okay, we've got ideas of connecting, understanding, showing understanding of learning, form ideas based on fact. One more. Showing and understanding. So concepts, when we think about concepts, and I think this is one of those more difficult terms that we use sometimes, but conceptualizing is thinking about those big, broad ideas. Jessica, I like that you're creating a picture or visualizing in some way. Leah shares. Conceptualizing is taking those big ideas and being able to think about them beyond a particular beyond one particular context. So when we think about, since the American Revolution was mentioned a number of times in the previous example, when we think about this concept of revolution, so revolutionary is a concept. If we're conceptualizing notions of revolution as we're talking with our fifth graders, maybe about the revolutionary movement, what are the attributes that go along with that? So we know that often it is it's a trigger point for something new. And if we read some historians, they talk about how it's often motivated by the young. So it's thinking about those legs by which we can attribute lots of different revolutions. And so when I say that idea of it's triggered by the young, so we might, if we're putting that idea to the test with the American Revolution, we think about those individuals like Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, who are bringing youth and new ideas to that movement. Similarly, when we think about the technological revolution or information age revolution, often those technologies and ideas were driven by the young, right? People who are in their early 20s. We think about Silicon Valley and the growth there. And so that might be a way in which we conceptualize. We put things together. Oh, okay, Katie, I'm looking here. My students hate my constant but why. Oh, but I love, Katie, that you are asking but why. That's exactly it. When we're critically thinking, we want not only us as teachers to be asking, but why? Say a little bit more. We want our students to be encouraged to be in that same spot. And so I want to just show two graphics here to the left-hand side. And so again, mirroring what we see in this definition, when we're thinking about the critical thinking skills in our own classrooms. So how are we in our classrooms giving students an opportunity to make observations? And those observations might be visual observations. They're using pieces of art or photographs. They might be observations based on reading that they're doing of written text. They may be observations of questions, films. So thinking broadly about how students observe and take in information that they then can conceptualize, apply, analyze, etc., is really important when we think about those discrete skills. that we umbrella as critical thinking skills? How are we giving them opportunities to analyze, make inferences, which is really, it can be very challenging, particularly with our younger students. How can they draw conclusions based on what they've read? We do this a lot with predicting as well, but thinking about what are those opportunities? How are they able to communicate? So critical thinking skill is not just keeping knowledge to ourselves, but it's sharing what I'm thinking about, whether it's in writing, verbally, in some nonverbal way to communicate with one another. Because again, it is sharing and thinking about ideas and generally problem solving. How am I trying to figure out the answer to the question, a solution to a problem? If you had to think about today's class, your academic day today, which of these 5, if any, did you have students do? In what way were your students critical thinkers today? Did they observe? Did they analyze? Did they make inferences? Did they communicate, or did they problem solve? And again, if you wouldn't mind popping that into the chat, and I promise I won't ask a follow-up question. I'm just kind of curious where we're most kind of comfortable and maybe where we're kind of might be stretching ourselves. Brittany, thanks for jumping out there right in front with problem solving. And again, promise no follow-up questions on this one. Okay, we've got some observations. It's hard to critical think when you have strep. You just want to get healthier. I like that. Okay, we've got some communication. Evidence, I like that. And communication, good. So there are some that are a little bit easier than others. And we think about, how we might, I like that in Elizabeth's class, they analyzed a primary source together. That's awesome. So there probably was a little bit of observation in there, some inferences that were made. I'm hoping the students were communicating as well. So there are some of these things, it's hard to say like, oh, I'm just doing one thing. Because these work in tandem with one another. But why do we do this? To go back to that but why question. And so again, I want to direct us a little bit here to this, the image, the graphic in the lower left-hand square. We want to think about, this is going to help our students with decision making. They don't become better decision makers if we don't give them the opportunity to practice this. So how do we say, what do you think about this image that you see? Is it this or is it that? And so those practices with decision making as part of their critical thinking skills is imperative. It helps their problem solving ability. It's also going to help their research skills, and that goes from questioning all the way through the production of new knowledge. Creativity was brought up in connection with critical thinking, and it shows students that there's a place for creativity in our classrooms, and there's a place for creativity in the world beyond our classrooms. I think so often students think creativity is something that they do on their own time or for fun. It's not really a play that academics and creativity aren't always intermixed. And in fact, we want to provide students the spaces to think creatively, to act and interact in ways that are different than others. And how does that really help them grow and develop as an individual? And when we think about all of these things, overall, we're helping students be curious. We're helping them be curious about the world around them, about the communities in which they live, and the communities that they hope to live in. So again, if we think about, social studies and the work that we do, we're thinking about them as current and future citizens. And so I know you have had experiences around the C3 framework, but I'm just going to do a little bit of an overview before we kind of move into a few examples. And so again, the C3 framework, which National Council for the Social Studies has been advocating that we follow as states and have informed the standards that we have within our states. Outlines that we are creating standards or thinking about instruction that help prepare students for college, career, and generally civic life. So this idea that the responsibility of creating the citizens of tomorrow really falls into the realm of social studies. And in order to be those active citizens, we've got to be active and responsible learners within classrooms. And so how do we work both individually and collectively towards this civic goal? And I would argue that it's really thinking about these critical thinking skills that we do. And so as part of this, we think about the ways in which we approach social studies as an inquiry. That is something that that we are, I hope, inherently curious about. And with that curiosity, we're working through this, and I quote, recursive process of developing questions, learning through disciplinary content and state standards to answer those questions, evaluating sources, and taking action to communicate our results. So again, that idea of really putting ownership and leaning on students' work and understanding as part of the instruction that we do in our classes. And so in order to follow this, I want to just kind of review briefly the 4 dimensions of the inquiry arc, because I think in the time that we're going to have over the next couple of months, we're going to delve into some of these a little more deeply. But first, thinking about this idea of developing questions and planning inquiries. So students develop questions in order to investigate societal issues, trends, or events. This is a hard thing to do right off the bat. This is something that we have to practice and prepare our students to do. To just say, as you've got this fantastic group of 4th graders coming into your room, tell me a big question that you have about a societal issue, is not fair. And they're not ready for it. So first we've got to know, what are the issues that are important? What are the questions that we can ask? What are the questions that are immediately answerable, answered with a little bit of work, answered with a little bit of work and a lot of creativity? And so we'll talk about that again, I think in our next session, which I'm excited about. We want students to lean into this idea of disciplinary concepts and tools. There are things that help to scaffold the work that's happening here. Questions don't just exist in the world, but they exist within a particular context. Again, I'm going to go back to the many references of the American Revolution. So when we think about those disciplinary concepts, it's things like revolution, democracy, rights, individual rights, all become significant in how we think about and understand the questions that we're asking and the approaches we might take to answer them. We want to give students an opportunity to evaluate sources and think about those sources, not just as the evidence they have to use, but sources of evidence that help them answer those questions and draw conclusions, which is really important. So if we think about, and I'll just use my own experiences as a student in a social studies classroom, the questions that were asked were almost immediately answered within the text, right? You saw the question, you could go back to paragraph 1 or the bold-faced word, and there was your answer. If we're promoting critical thinking amongst our students, we're asking questions that draw a little bit from the text, an understanding from a bold-faced word, some prior knowledge, and maybe something else. There's something else there that students may draw on or use. So how do they pull those together to make sense of them? And sometimes pulling those things together means actually getting rid of some of the evidence to say, oh, Miss King actually gave me 4 pieces of things to read to answer this question, but only 2 are really helpful. I might use the other 2 pieces somewhere else. That's an important piece. That's critical thinking to evaluate what's in and what's out in terms of their learning and understanding. And then finally, how do we give students the opportunity to communicate their conclusions? Once they've found these things out, how are they able to share those, whether it's in small scale to the person who's sitting across from them, large scale to their class, larger scale to their school, and even further to their school communities, if we're asking those questions of relevance. So with that in mind, oh, here we go. Okay. I'm going to ask you, so here's my question, is what's the relationship of these three sources? So that's just a way to kind of set up an inquiry, a way of thinking. So you have a map of Philadelphia in the 1790s. That's what's to the right. To the left, you have a drawing of a mosquito. And your third source is this. Okay, so anyone who's spent about 3 minutes outside in the middle of summer has heard that noise, right? Buzzing around their ears. That's, of course, a mosquito. So I also have a quote here from Lori Halls Anderson's book, Fever 1793, which begins, I woke to the sound of mosquito buzzing. That's what we just heard in my left ear, and my mother screaming in the right. So between the sound of the mosquito, the drawing of the mosquito, and the map of Philadelphia, does anyone want to venture a guess? And I would hope there'd be a couple of guesses here. Okay, Bobby's already jumped in. The link between geography and health of the New England colonies. What are some other hypotheses of the relationship of these three sources? And go ahead, and Bobby, you're getting some thumbs up, which is great. If you wouldn't mind in the chat, what are some of the connections here? Spread of disease. Wendy, there is no disease here. I can't imagine. Anyone else want to venture a guess? So this is setting us up to think about this larger question of how does disease impact history and or society. So in fact, so I told you the quote there was from the book Fever 1793, which is about the yellow fever epidemic that went through Philadelphia in the summer and into the early fall of 1793. In 1793, they didn't know that mosquitoes were carriers of yellow fever, but they knew that in this port city of Philadelphia, that's why that map is important. And so the geography connection, Bobby, was awesome. That there was always this constant buzzing of mosquitoes and then people falling ill to yellow fever again and again. And so when we think about a question like this, in some cases you might say, oh gosh, how does disease impact history and or society? That seems really big. And is that in my standards? And I would argue it absolutely is in your standards. So I've pulled this high school standard from the Kentucky standards, but analyze how human settlements are influenced by or influence the relationship between people and the environment. And so thinking about that standard and this idea, this yellow fever epidemic is a great opportunity to engage students in thinking about these relationships. Again, a higher order thinking skill of building relationships or considering relationships, and then the impact of that. I've also identified here some of these C3 indicators, which help us draw a little more substantively on some of the skills that we want students to be able to connect with, and thinking about ideas of multidisciplinary lenses, etc. So when we think about that, if you've got a phone handy and can click on that QR code, I'd like you to do this, because those big questions are the first place that we go, that we're able to ask students to kind of take a look and to start to make hypotheses here. But then in order to build students to those critical thinking questions, those questions for inquiry, we have to begin to scaffold them. And so in order to scaffold them, we start to ask supporting questions. And these supporting questions that I've identified here around this, how does disease impact history or society? I focused again on yellow fever. And so we've got a couple of supporting questions here, including what is yellow fever? Not a higher order thinking skill. That's going to be one of those things that students divine. But our higher order thinking skill, the thing that is going to demand a more critical approach for students is, and why did it spread in Philadelphia in 1793? So in order to answer that, and again, you have these resources with the QR code, we're pulling together a number of things for students to investigate, because it's not, if it's a call and response, then we're working again on that remember and sometimes on that understand level. But we want students to really think critically about this, because even that idea of what is yellow fever, what yellow fever was in 1793 and what it is in 2023, that's right, that's where we are. Well, we're in 24 now, is very different, right? There are things that we know and understand about the ways in which disease spreads, etc., that help us understand that differently. And so one of the there are a couple of resources again that you'll see here that I think are really would be interesting and provocative to students around this, including a primary source. So we had some primary source analysis that was happening today around the ways in which the Washingtons, Hamilton, and Jefferson navigated the yellow fever. How does this sit in the context of other outbreaks during the time? And then lastly, thanks, Wendy, for adding that QR code. Appreciate it. And then finally, what was going on in Philadelphia at the time? Again, there were a lot of questions about whether or not, or where yellow fever actually originated from, because you've got in a port city, people coming in and out, goods coming in and out. So there are all of these possibilities and unknowns. And so it's one thing to know what this disease is, but it's another thing to know how we treat those who are suffering from yellow fever. And again, think about, how does knowing what yellow fever is and how it spread help us answer the question about the impact that that disease has on history? How does treatment help us think about the impact on history and society? And so we're using yellow fever here, but I'm thinking about polio vaccines. I'm thinking about COVID vaccines, or the ways in which people respond to various ways in which one might treat an ailment that is widespread within a society or a community. This is a great way to think about the impact on society. And so we'll make the connection real quick here to COVID. One of the ways in which a student might say, well, COVID impacted history or society by Clorox wipes and hand sanitizer sales going through the roof in the spring of 2020, right? So there's this economic implication that happens. So it doesn't just have to be historical or political. It could be absolutely social, absolutely economic in different ways. In order for students to see parallels between past and present, again, one of the great things about critical thinking and higher order thinking skills is that, like today, where there are a variety of ways in which people might treat diseases or think about the treatment of diseases, that was also the case in the 18th century. And so in this text, but also we know in the historical record, we've got two really distinct camps of how we might contend with this disease. And so students can evaluate which they think is better. So Dr. Rush was Dr. Benjamin Rush. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was also a really strong proponent of purging. And so purging in lots of different ways. So he felt that you could rid your body of disease by bleeding, which was very common at the time. He also created something called Russia's Thunderbolt, which was used on the Lewis and Clark expedition, so that if they were starting to feel ill, it would actually purge them. It would purge everything out of their system. So they would either vomit or bowel movements. And okay, so nerdy fun fact. He also put mercury in it. So there are points we can trace along the Lewis and Clark Trail out to the west because there are mercury deposits in the landscape. And so they were there and they had camped overnight. It's, again, kind of a gross. I used to teach 7th grade, so I needed those fun, gross facts. That was part of it. So you pose to your students, there are these 2 ways of thinking about that they approached this. Which do you think would be better? Oh, okay, Amy, thank you. You also teach the leeches. Good Benjamin Rush supporter there. So how do students make sense of this? Think about it within their own context. Have they gone to the doctor and has there been a jar of leeches? Oh my gosh, I hope not. But we don't know. So how do we connect students? Again, treatment helps us think about impact on society. What this is, what a disease is, helps us think about the impact on society. And then we think about daily life, how your acts and actions might change as a result of either widespread disease or not so widespread. And so we know, and this appears in your standards again and again, thinking about the diversity of perspectives and understandings of how an event or a series of events impacted one group of people or groups of people differently than others. And so how do we help to not just say, this is how it impacted society, but it impacted particular people within society in one way, similar to or different than another. So really, again, as we're talking through this, I hope one of the things you're hearing is, how do we really nuance this for students? This is more than the sentence answer. It's getting them to think complexly about the world around them. So one of the ways that you might think about this, I'll just talk about this for 1 second, is across those questions, it's not just about putting work in front of them and a series of materials. And again, we'll have some opportunities as we move forward to work with some of these in subsequent sessions, but also thinking about, how do I know my students know this? And so I might have them respond in an exit ticket, a simple 3x5 note card that says, in which I say, in a sentence or 2, tell me what yellow fever is and why it spread in Philadelphia. We also might have students think about creating a 6-word memoir. And I think I've shared that with this group before, that idea of thinking about in reflection, 6 words that help us remember either Dr. Rush or Dr. Devez, who was of the philosophy. I just went with the gory one. The other school of thought about curing yellow fever was to get out into the countryside, to breathe fresh air, to get out of sort of the dirt of the city in order to heal. And so how do you, in 6 words, memorialize that contribution? And we can do this again and again when we think about our historical studies. And then finally, when we think about daily life, we might actually ask students to create a 1-pager. And those of you that use 1-pagers, I hope you can speak positively about them, but it's thinking about, how do I get that piece of plain white paper and fill it with words, images, ideas that help me respond to that prompt. And so again, going back earlier, how does this demonstrate a level of not just knowledge, understanding, but creativity and evaluation for students? So giving you some ideas to think about that. So then I want us to think about, how do we do this? How do we start to take our classrooms and move them from a place in which, and I know all of you have been working with in charge and in programming in ways that I know you're already furthering critical thinking with your students and higher order thinking skills. But I want us to really shift our conversations, and this happens really often, of covering information in our class to turning it into a question. So instead of, I covered the American Revolution, we ask the question about the American Revolution. So for example, if we think about this standard, and our standards are a great place to start because our standards are, I feel like they force us to say, I covered this. I covered an explanation of the role of changing political, social, economic perspectives in the lives of diverse groups of people in the colonial era. Instead of saying, I covered that, I want us to think about it in terms of what roles, political, social, economic, did women play in the colonial era? So identifying one of those diverse groups. And now I'm going to pose that to my students. My students might come back, my 5th grade students or my 8th grade students in the case of the standard, and they might say, well, what does it mean to have a political role? That's a great question. That's a good starting point. And what that's telling me, if my students are asking me this question about the question, is they're trying to parse out what are those big concepts or ideas. So we may say a political role is to serve in a political office. We also might say it is an activist, someone who is talking back or trying to make political change. Social role, how do they interact or act within society? Someone who has an economic role could be a business owner, but they're a buyer or a seller. Now I'm pulling in some economic concepts or ideas that they had previously. And then I might, because I am a fan of picture books, again, as we've been able to work together, I might pull out my Independent Dames book. And I hope that at some point, Wendy, everyone has gotten this book. But what this does, it's a fantastic book if you're not familiar with it. It goes page by page of really thinking about women in the American Revolution and the Revolutionary era. And I know we've got colonial era here, but I'm pushing it to the Revolution, in which it looks at a societal example. How do women serve in roles of care and nursing? And I would argue, I think I did this with a 7th grade class who said, well, wait, does a nurse just have to be, is that just a social contribution? And I said, well, say a little bit more. What else could it be? Well, she might make money. I hope she makes money. So is that an economic decision? Great. Say a little bit more about that. Talk me through it. Then another student, in that same class, this was a really good group of kids. They said, but isn't it political? Because what if she's on the other side? What if she is nursing students or nursing soldiers for the British? That seems like a political move, like that you decide one way or the other. And then all of a sudden we're thinking about this big question in this really, really interesting and individual ways. So one of the things that happens is not everybody's assignment looks the same. And I would argue that is an incredible thing, right? If I've got a stack of 30 papers, it would be really interesting to read 30 different perspectives or points of view. Can also make it a little more challenging, thinking about consistency, but then we think about what are the criteria? What are students demonstrating in terms of a thesis statement, use of evidence, these other things that again are feeding towards this bigger idea of demonstrating critical thinking with the ideas that they're doing. So I would like you to think about, and just as kind of the one of the closing things that we'll do here together in the chat, I'd like you to add a why or a how question that might drive tomorrow's instruction and critical thinking in the classroom. So you know what the standards are that you're going to be using tomorrow, and maybe you use the similar ones today. What's a how or a why question? And I put the how and the why for a broadness. I know I have what roles and I used a what, but again, kind of play along here. So what's a how or a why question you might use for tomorrow? And again, by having us put it in the chat and knowing many of you teach similar grade levels, I think we're working together towards a common goal here. Okay, the time that it takes with the chat means that there's only good questions that are being developed. Oh, who is responsible for the Boston Massacre? How do you know? I like that. And the how do you know is such kid-friendly language, Bobby. I really appreciate you framing it that way as opposed to the use evidence period, which isn't necessarily inviting students. I almost think sometimes, and I use this myself, I'm daring students. Oh, how were the sit-in protests helpful? How do you know? Great. How could women play a political role without being able to vote? Ooh, Jessica, I love that question. Why did the people feel the Articles of Confederation were weak? Nice. Yeah, I mean, it's that tested. Yeah, how do you know that a government is weak if you're living within it? That's gonna be a great question. How would you respond to the berries burning if you had been one of the Logan children? Why? Oh, Kim, I like what you've done there because you're asking students to not only evaluate, but take a position or a point of view of another. And again, that demands a level of understanding for students to enter into that. And so thinking about there may be some scaffolding around that, but what a fantastic question. And so with that, we've got lots of good questions to go into class with tomorrow that I hope you have the opportunity to, again, engage your students in phenomenal ways. And I just want to say thank you. It has been, as always, a pleasure. We're not walking away maybe with direct strategies like we've done in sessions past. We will absolutely do that in future, but we just needed to set a little bit of groundwork this afternoon. And it's really been great to see so many of you again.
Thank you so much. I was super excited about this, and I told Kristy when I was emailing, I was like, "We're so excited to have you back with us." So I know, I can see from the chat that every one of you all are so excited to have her back as well. For those of you that this is your first time hearing Dr. Kristy Brugar, I know that you are as excited as well. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. And I really love how you kind of challenged every one of us to think about versus covering, think about identifying. That was really, really good. So thank you again. Makes me super, super excited about all the other sessions. And you all will look at the calendar and see we do have some other sessions scheduled with Dr. Brugar. So super exciting. If you enjoyed the session, I know you will look forward to those others as well. And I am dropping the evaluation into the chat. So make sure you complete that for today. That is your attendance check. And I know that several of you, just make sure that you do complete these. I know that we have several. I do go back and check those. And several of you are forgetting to complete your evaluations. And just make sure that you are completing those timely. I know if you're driving in a car, please don't try to fill it out while you're driving. That would not be safe. But just make sure that you do fill those out pretty timely so that you do get credit for attending tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to stay on. Otherwise, you will have a great evening. We do have
hey, Wendy.
Yes, ma'am.
The evaluation that I just pulled up is not the correct one. It says it's dated 2/26.
Oh,
it's for hero only.
That would be me. Sorry, I got too excited over this session. I was listening away, Dr. Brugar, and just got so excited and pulled up your name. That would be me. Hold on, I'll do that. Yeah, it says hero. Sorry, guys. That's me trying to multitask. I was watching away and got too involved.
So here's what happened. She took host rights away from me without me even knowing, and I was trying to stop the recording. So there you go. That's what happens when you kind of sneak and take host rights away, because I've been trying